here are four really bad reasons to oppose SJW Christianity. Now, I think you should oppose SJW Christianity because it's a horrible, horrible thing. But if you use any of these four reasons, I think you should probably reconsider and maybe watch my video of the four really good reasons to oppose it. But the first real bad reason to oppose SJW Christianity is because you're a Republican. That's a stupid reason to oppose SJW Christianity. A lot of SJWs are Democrats. That's very true. But here's the thing. The gospel message is a political message. So don't let anyone tell you that it's not a political message. And actually, we'll talk about that in a second. It's a political message, but it's not a partisan message. And so Republicans do things that, in my estimation, are against Scripture. I think that there are some things that you could look at Republicans' politics and their positions and say that's against Scripture, that's against Scripture. Not all of them are against Scripture, of course, but it's a really kind of a shallow reason to say, well, SJWs are typically Democrats and I'm a Republican, so I oppose it. That's too shallow. It's not foundational enough. And I think a lot of times the SJW side will straw man their opposition as, hey, they're just rabid zealots for the Republican Party and they don't really think about things too much. So if that's your reason, your primary reason for opposing SJW Christianity, I would suggest you look into it a lot deeper and come up with some better reasons. The second very bad reason to oppose SJW Christianity is you have this idea that, look, you should just stick to the gospel. The gospel is the most important thing, and all this other stuff, just leave it aside. I don't want to hear it. Well, that's really not a smart reason to oppose it, because the gospel applies to every area of life, including social justice. Now, I think the SJWs misapply the biblical standard of justice, but that doesn't mean that the gospel doesn't apply to justice. It does. But you just need to make sure you have a foundation, biblically speaking, of what justice is and how to implement it, and really what the goals of justice are, because they're not what SJWs think they are. So this idea of stick to the gospel doesn't affect society and my social life and political things, that's wrong. That's not a smart way to go, because it definitely does. You'll lose that debate. But the debate you will win is the one that says, okay, let's talk about biblical standards of justice. Let's talk about biblical standards of law. And the SJWs have nothing to say there. In fact, you'll never find the Bible talk about proportional representation. You'll never find the Bible talk about robbing Peter to pay Paul. You'll never find that kind of stuff about generational sin where everyone's guilty for the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. You'll never find it because it's not in the Bible. They make that up as they go along. And so, if you say, hey, stick to the gospel is the most important thing, and that's your primary reason to oppose SJW Christianity, I think you should reconsider. Another third reason the really bad reason to oppose SJW Christianity is to say something like, well, Martin Luther King was immoral. He was a serial adulterer and he was a heretic, and so therefore I oppose, what you're doing, venerating Martin Luther King. Well, that might be true. Martin Luther King certainly seemed to be a heretic, formal, and not just he had bad theology. He was actually a formal, non-Christian heretic. And he also probably, it seems like he was pretty immoral. But that's kind of irrelevant to the issue of whether or not SJWs are right. Martin Luther King aside, you could still be right and your leader be wrong. You know what I mean? If MLK was a leader. So that's a stupid reason, I think, as well, because you got to understand that there's immoral people and there's heretics on the non-SJW side as well, so they could easily turn that around. That's a very poor reason to be against social justice warriors in the church. Another really bad reason to be a social justice warrior in the church, and actually I don't think very many people ever say this, but this is something that SJWs like to straw man as our position. What they'll say is, there is no racism in the church, or there is no racism at all. And that's not true. Of course, there are people out there that are racist. There are people in the church probably that are racist. I've never met one, but I'm sure that they exist. What we do want to oppose is this idea that it's just rampant and obvious and nobody calls it out. Because here's the thing, when churches come out and there's racist people in the church, they're called out immediately and marked off and say, well, that's not biblical. That happens all the time. But this idea of sort of this kind of like secret racism where it's like you're not really racist, but you kind of have these preferences and things like that. This is all nonsense. They've redefined the word racism to make it sort of this rampant thing, and it's just not reality. So on the one hand, we want to admit, yes, there are racist people in the world. There are racist people potentially in the church, but it's not this rampant problem. And so if you think there's no racism at all, that's a very bad reason to oppose SJWs. But if you think that it's not rampant, I think that's actually probably a good reason. Anyway, I hope this was helpful, and if you haven't watched my other video, please watch the other one for good reasons to oppose SJW Christianity.